Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth.
Arriba La Paz! La Paz!
Flags from across Latin America were flown and worn proudly Sunday night. Many say they're still grappling with the news they've been waiting decades to hear.
When I woke up, I said, oh, it happened. It really happened. I couldn't believe it. I said, finally, jumping down like for 2 hours.
Oh, what a difference a raid makes. Look at how the white media's coverage of Trump has changed its complexion overnight. Not so long ago, I told you to expect an orgy of white media propaganda that would show only people saying how great the arrest of Nicolas Maduro was, and here it is. The white media, as usual, cherry-picking people to put in front of their cameras and to push the narrative they want the public to see. This is the same thing they do when they put certain select political activists like D. Ray McKesson and these other Democrat operatives in front of the cameras, but they don't tell the viewers that these people weren't selected at random, that these white media outlets already knew who they were in advance. But the reason that this is the subject of this morning's briefing is, isn't it interesting how immigrants have gone from hating Trump to just loving him now, because he went and nabbed one guy from a banana republic?
Why are people here so excited?
We are celebrating freedom and liberty. Thanks to President Trump, we were able to gain our freedom back.
My wife hasn't been able to go home since she was a kid. My kids have never gone to Venezuela, so this is huge.
As usual, the white media turns on a dime depending on what their corporate masters want them to do. It's nice to see, though, that the same Latino community who was up in arms about Trump's ICE raids loves him now, according to the white media, that is. Oh, wait, these are white Latinos cheering him. People who have been the most able to play on not being mestizos or what have you. People who in most cases feel like they have everything in common with people like Marco Rubio. No matter what these people on the camera may be telling you, neither Nicolas Maduro nor his predecessor Chavez was forcing anyone out of Venezuela. But Trump's sure been forcing people out of the U.S. Just a few days ago, this was a huge problem, especially for Latinos, but apparently it's not anymore. Who would have thought that little Marco Rubio, of all people, would wind up being the one figuring out how to lead the orange man around by the nose? Because Marco Rubio's folks are from Cuba. That's the reason why he's got a burr in his bonnet about this whole let's use the military to get rid of Latin leaders that we don't like. So Rubio's been making some not-so-veiled threats that the Trump regime is going to be gunning for some other leaders, including Cuba, if possible. And there have been right-wing mouthpieces also saying that something needs to be done about Colombia's president, too.
Members of Vente Venezuela, the political party of opposition leader Maria Corina Machado.
The liberation of Venezuela may represent also the liberation of Nicaragua, Cuba, Colombia, all the region that has been victims of this evil project that the Castros spread along all the continent.
You look at a map and you see that Colombia and Venezuela are side by side. And it's really bizarre that they're gunning for Colombia and making these veiled threats against them because Colombia actually allowed the U.S. to do whatever the hell they want. They've been partnering with the U.S. for all kinds of stuff for decades now. But apparently this change in tone toward Colombia might have something to do with their current president, a guy named Gustavo Petro. He's a former member of the leftist guerrilla group M19. That's about as leftist as one can get. As a former guerrilla, this guy makes all the right noises when it comes to socialist or pseudo-socialist policies. But one of the things that he did was he made an Afro-Latina his vice president. Well, maybe that's the reason why the GOP is looking and going, we were fine with the Colombians up until this guy got in there. One of the things about Colombia is a good number of those folks see themselves as being white. They have the same issue that their next door neighbor Venezuela has. You got a lot of Blancos there too, just like in Mexico, just like in Cuba and the rest of Latin America. And these Blancos think of Colombia as being a white country. So seeing an Afro-Latina as their vice president, that's the kind of thing that makes them furious, among other things. And I know full well that Colombia isn't stopping anybody from going there. There's no dictatorial regime in place there. And I know full well that the U.S. government doesn't have a problem with them because during the Obama administration, there was a scandal because the Secret Service were down there partying like frat rats, hanging out with hookers, and having a good old time. Petro and his black vice president have been in charge there for the last few years. So why are we suddenly hearing extremists in Ron DeSantis' Florida agitating to overthrow a democratically elected government? In this case, you can't even push the lie that the Colombians' presidential elections were questionable, or that the president wasn't legitimately elected, and yet we're seeing the white media give a platform to some wannabe Blancos in Florida to say that Trump needs to send in the military to kidnap Colombia's president next. So this isn't about democracy. The US itself doesn't and has never been a democracy and overthrows them in other countries. And it's not about human rights either. The US is the biggest human rights violator on earth, 5% of the world's population, but more people behind bars than any other country, including China, Iran, or Venezuela. Oh, and on a side note, Colombia has elections this year. In fact, their presidential elections take place in May. President Petro and his black vice president are constitutionally barred from seeking a consecutive second term, so Petro's not even on the ballot this time around. And yet you got people down in Ron DeSantis' Florida who are saying that Trump needs to go down there with the military and do something about him. So in 5 months, the people of Colombia will be able to decide who they want as their president, but of course, white supremacy is all about white power choosing who the winners are. And this is a large part of why Latin America has been a basket case. Culturally, they happen to have this racial schizophrenia going, and that leaves them wide open for the acceptance of political strongmen, so long as those political strongmen identify as white. Just look at Argentina, one of their classic banana republics, totalitarian regimes, and yet nobody's talking about toppling the government there. The Argentinians think of themselves as Europeans. In fact, that's how they see Argentina, as a European country in South America. That's why so many Nazis went there, because prior to the Second World War, there was already a large German immigrant community in Argentina, and that number only grew after the war. So those people in Argentina don't think of themselves as white Latinos, they just think of themselves as plain white. That's where a lot of this agitation is coming from. Whether it be Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, Colombia, or anywhere else, we see the same griping from these refugees who come to the U.S. Whenever any government in Latin America who's to the left of Nixon comes to power, we got all of these people who show up in the U.S. griping, and these people are the ones who were part of the ruling class prior to these countries' political revolutions. And yet nobody ever asks if maybe these guys were responsible for those political upheavals taking place.
Again, I know I just asked you this, but I'll kind of ask it on the record now. About how long ago did you leave Venezuela?
It was about 2014 when my son was 1 year old. I couldn't stay more because I was in a point where if I didn't have diapers and we couldn't buy them, so or anything, and I had to hey, I have milk, do you have diapers? So we started trading things to try to survive, and I just didn't want to put my son through all of that, so I thought that the best thing was trying to leave.
These people are not political refugees because no one was persecuting them. There's some sore heads angry that their gravy train got derailed. They were the ones who were in charge before those political revolutions took place. They chose to be in exile. They put themselves in exile. They can go back home anytime they want, and in fact, I'll bet you any amount of money that a lot of those same people you see in front of the cameras complaining, they have gone back to Venezuela many times to see their family and friends or to check up on their businesses. They just don't say that in front of the cameras. And in the case of beating the drum against Colombia, the white media is not even bothering to put any Colombians in front of the camera. They just have some rando nobody do it instead. Because I'm sure with the barbaric savagery of the drug cartels in the 80s and 90s, there's all kinds of people who can't wait to go to Colombia to liberate that place, right? But this is who the white media is putting in front of the cameras. This is them trying to conjure magic. Now, I'm sure that the trolls and shills in the comments will say, "But Professor, you're just a Negro in the United States. You've never been to Latin America. You have not seen what they did in Venezuela." First of all, do you think any of the people who like to throw that accusation at me would do so if I agreed with them? Do you think that if I agreed with them, they would be saying, well, you've never actually been to these places that you keep talking about. You've never actually been to Iran when you made your video about them. You've never actually been to South Africa or Zimbabwe when you made your videos about them. But you seem to be pretty informed on the issues. Do you think they would be saying that? Of course not. They only talk about whether or not you've been there personally if you disagree with them. So let me go ahead and concede your empty point. My analyses and my information comes from academic and news sources and from my own common sense. And while I don't know anything about Venezuela from personal experience, I do know that a lot of these same Venezuelans you see on TV have been as racist as the day is long toward foundational black Americans, hell, toward Afro-Latinos in places like Miami and elsewhere. Now that I do know from personal experience. So you'll have to forgive me if I have no burning desire to see the country that created all these racists. But there is one thing I do know. Nobody has stopped either tourists nor Venezuelan nationals from going to Venezuela. In fact, a bunch of Latino and foreign tourists go there and have always gone to Venezuela freely. Venezuela doesn't have a travel ban on anyone. They have not and are not restricting anyone from going there. The white media's definitely had no problems getting in. But this is all about pushing a lie that these are all a bunch of politically persecuted individuals. They're all political refugees. No, the reality is these people were the ones who actually were living off the fat of the land when they were there. They were the ones who were plugged in because of the previous regimes, the Blanco rulers. And once Chavez and the mestizos got in there, now all of a sudden these folks found themselves on the outs. That's what really happened. These people no doubt have gone to Venezuela many times, but this isn't about the truth. It's about cementing a particular narrative. But there's also one other thing that does need to be mentioned here. Maduro and Colombia's president also have something else in common. They both condemned Israel's genocide in Gaza, and they both supported the idea of prosecuting Netanyahu. And they have also engaged in long-standing diplomatic relations with countries like Iran and others, countries that the U.S. says you shouldn't be talking to. And that seems to keep coming up over and over and over again from the white right, especially the GOP politicians whenever they talk about these countries. That seems to be the main thing that they have front of mind whenever they talk about who needs to be toppled.
We want them to stop the drug and the weapons trafficking. We want them to take the refugees back. We want them to kick out the Iranians, the Cubans, the Islamic radicals like Hezbollah, and just return to being a normal nation. And this is an operation that the United States conducted on our own, without any coordination or cooperation from other countries, to advance our national interest, which is to stop the drug trafficking and stop Venezuela from cooperating with countries like Russia and China and Cuba and Iran.
The more you look at this, you notice that similarity. That's one of the most consistent things about this whole fiasco. So these guys are just putting it out there. This is what their rationale for toppling a government is. Are you doing anything that might be weakening Israel's position? And that begs the question, where are the Democrats while all this is going on? Shouldn't they be up in arms? Shouldn't these guys basically be fit to be tied? Instead, we're hearing barely a peep. Keep in mind that for the last few years, all we've heard about was so-called Project 2025, and that America was about to become Nazi Germany, etc., as we needed to vote for the Democrats. We have to vote for the Democrats and support them. No questions asked. In fact, you're not even going to get anything from them, but you have to support them because they are the only ones who are resisting the Orange Man. They're the only ones trying to fight him, they said. Okay, and what has the response from the resistance been to this unprecedented act? Well, Chuck Schumer was so incensed, so furious, that he said Trump should have asked Congress first. Why didn't he run it by them first before he did this? Get their input on it. And Hakeem Jeffries, his statement was just as empty. He began by repeating the narrative that, quote, Nicolas Maduro is a criminal and authoritarian dictator, oppressed the people of Venezuela for years. He is not the legitimate head of government. The rule of law and democracy have broken down in Venezuela. The usual Democrat shills and ops have claimed falsely that Jeffries was condemning Trump and that he was denouncing him, etc. That's not a denunciation. He begins by repeating all of the same shop-worn lines about Maduro to justify what happened. This is not condemnation. This is message discipline, and both parties are on board with this. Like Schumer, all Jeffries did was to give the predictable tisk-tisk because Trump didn't go to Congress first, but clearly that wasn't front of mind for him. The very first thing he wanted to say was, well, Nicolas Maduro is an authoritarian, and he's oppressed the people of Venezuela for years, and he's not the legitimate head of government. Everything that he said was to repeat every talking point that's been said about the Venezuelan government for the last 25 years. That's what his first impulse was to do, to reinforce the narrative. He didn't object, oppose, or even give a hint of disapproval to what he himself claims is a blatantly unconstitutional act. When a president violates the Constitution, that's supposed to be grounds for impeachment, right? That's what we should have heard from Jeffries first, or at least from Schumer at all, but we haven't heard it. Both Jeffries and Schumer were very careful to avoid saying what ought to be done about a president who takes military action without going through Congress. I don't know how competent a head of state either Chavez or Maduro were, but I do know that a large part of their country's problems came from the U.S. using its money and political influence to sanction their country to cripple their economy, and then having the CIA and other elements backing dissident elements inside Venezuela to wage war on their own country. All because the Blancos were no longer in power. And Venezuela was not some beacon of democracy or prosperity prior to Chavez either. That's the entire reason why the people down there elected him in the first place. As I told you on Sunday, there were and have been international observers for Venezuela's elections from the EU, and they wrote reports about the presidential elections under Chavez, and they said that he had been elected legitimately. But Hakeem Jeffries didn't seem to know that either. Apparently, the only thing Hakeem Jeffries and the Democrats are resisting is reading. These phony statements sound like they were put out by ChatGPT, or at the very least, some half-brained spin doctor who's trying to thread the needle and both endorse what Trump did, while at the same time pretending to pacify the activist base. It's all political theater. So we see the so-called resistance endorsing what Trump did, and not one of them is saying one syllable about this is grounds for impeachment. As Noam Chomsky said, the most sophisticated form of propaganda is when something presents itself as opposition, or should I say resistance, when in reality it's actually support. Well, here Trump is annexing the Sudetenland, and the resistance is backing him up on it. And the Latino immigrants who are upset about the deportations and saying that Latino voters would make their voices heard this election cycle, well, now they got the white media ignoring them completely, and worse, portraying them as being on Trump's side. That he needs to topple more Latin American countries, because when poor countries are destabilized and their leaders are suddenly toppled, that never leads to mass migrations from these unstable countries, am I right? Nobody's going to make a stink about Maduro except the same handful of professional protesters in New York and maybe LA, but that's not a movement. Certainly not one that can change what the government intends to do. And it undermines the message of discontent when you have the white media flooding the zone with images of smiling white Latinos who say not only are they glad Maduro is out, but they want Trump to go overthrow other people's Latin countries. This is media theater. It has nothing to do with the condition or the rights of the people in Latin America, but everything to do with advancing someone's political agenda. The message from this propaganda is loud and clear. As Elon Musk said, we'll coup whoever we want. This incident has forced people to have to go on the record with what they really think. The people who spent years lecturing the black grassroots about how we're wrong for not automatically supporting the Democrats and how we shouldn't be making any demands, the elections are too important, the moment too crucial, the threat too great for you to be making any pathetic demands. You just need to vote and do what you're told. Now those same people are sounding like us and saying how useless the Democrats are. Some of them have even gone so far as to say that it makes no sense to vote for the so-called resistance if they're only too happy to keep making deals with Trump. Democrats are expected to get the House of Representatives back this year. And when they do, the calls for them to bring articles of impeachment will be deafening. But don't expect the Democrats to bring any regarding this event in Venezuela, because between the oil cartels and the Israel lobby, both the major parties have seen how Latin America's begun to shift to the left, and worse, that some of those guys down there started thinking they don't have to toe the line anymore, and they want it stopped. Will Cuba be next? Little Marco would love that, but one thing's for sure, even if all these countries' governments fall, none of the people you see complaining on TV are going to be rushing to go back home. They got it better here than they ever did down there, even before Chavez or Petro or anyone else became president. Can anyone conceive of a scenario where a mental midget like little Marco Rubio could get elected dog catcher, much less senator, if he wasn't in the U.S.? Do you think he would be enjoying his standard of living and his esteem and prestige if he was still back in Cuba? People use that whole political persecution hustle as a way to skip the line and get themselves a quickie legal status for immigration purposes. That's why so many people rely on and use it. And while it's true they may genuinely politically disagree with the ruling government back home, it's also true that they're in no hurry to go back under any circumstances. So don't look for any mass movement on any of these immigrants' part to say, hey, Venezuela is free now, let's go back and rebuild. That was never the plan. It was always to find a way to get into the U.S., ingratiate themselves with the white powers that be, and then enjoy living here instead. Viva la finesse. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Rayshawn Collins, Terrence Curley, Glenda Tice, Marilyn McCoy, and Marshall. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.